The Vorthak Empire had conquered 47 star systems without breaking a sweat. Their military analysts were the best in the galaxy, and they had spent 8 months studying Earth before making their move. Every communication they intercepted, every piece of data they gathered, pointed to the same conclusion that filled Commander Veltar with confidence as he reviewed the final invasion plans. Earth's humans were weak after military service ended. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Human veterans spoke constantly about something called retirement, after which they received regular payments from their government and spent their days in what could only be described as peaceful, harmless activities. The Vorthak surveillance drones had recorded thousands of hours of these elderly former warriors engaged in the most non-threatening behaviors imaginable. They tended small gardens with gentle care. They sat on park benches feeding birds. They visited buildings called libraries where they read quietly for hours. Many spent entire afternoons playing slow games with small round objects on carefully maintained grass fields. The most aggressive activity the drones recorded was something called fishing, where the humans sat motionless by water for hours, apparently trying to catch food in the most inefficient way possible. Commander Veltar's chief intelligence officer, a brilliant analyst named Korthvel, had compiled a detailed report that made their strategy seem foolproof. Sir, human biology clearly follows the same pattern we see in most warrior species. After years of combat service, their aggressive capabilities diminish significantly. They become docile, spending their final decades in quiet contemplation and simple pleasures. The numbers supported this theory perfectly. Earth's active military numbered approximately 15 million soldiers across all their various forces. But their records showed over 50 million retired veterans living peacefully in small communities across the planet. If these were still dangerous warriors, Earth would have been unstoppable. Instead, they seemed to represent no threat at all. Veltar studied the intercepted human communications with growing excitement. The retired soldiers talked about pension checks, and medical appointments, and grandchildren visits. They complained about aching joints, and doctor visits, and something called early bird specials at eating establishments. These were clearly the concerns of beings whose fighting days were long behind them. The surveillance footage confirmed everything. The retired humans moved slowly, used mobility assistance devices, and gathered in groups to engage in sedentary activities like sitting around tables moving small flat objects in patterns. Some wore clothing identifying their past military service, but they seemed proud of having survived to reach this peaceful phase of life. It's actually quite merciful when you think about it, Korthvel had observed during their final planning session. Their biology ensures that their warriors don't have to face the horror of dying in battle. They get to live out their final years in complete safety and comfort. The Vorthak invasion strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Phase 1 would eliminate Earth's active military installations with surgical precision, scattering their forces and destroying their command structure. Phase 2 would involve occupying the civilian areas where the harmless retired veterans lived, accepting their inevitable surrender with minimal bloodshed. 300 Vorthak warships entered Earth's atmosphere under cover of darkness, their advanced stealth systems making them invisible to human detection equipment. The first wave of plasma bombardment struck military bases on every continent simultaneously. Radar installations vanished in brilliant flashes. Naval yards erupted into molten metal. Air Force bases became smoking craters. The human military's response was exactly what the Vorthak expected: confused, scattered, and increasingly desperate as their communication networks failed and their leadership was eliminated. Within 6 hours, organized human military resistance had been reduced to isolated pockets of survivors trying to regroup without success. Commander Veltar watched the tactical displays with satisfaction as Phase 1 concluded ahead of schedule. Now came the easy part. His occupation forces would land in the quiet suburban areas and small towns where the retired veterans lived, and these harmless elderly humans would gratefully accept Vorthak protection now that their government had been defeated. The first landing zones were carefully selected to avoid causing unnecessary distress to the docile retirees. Millfield was a typical human retirement community: tree-lined streets, small shops, modest homes where the former warriors spent their peaceful final years. The town had a population of about 8,000, with over half being military veterans who had settled there to enjoy their harmless golden years. Squad leader Thekmore led the first patrol into Millfield as the sun rose over Earth. His instructions were simple: make contact with the local retired veterans, explain that their military had been defeated, and begin organizing them for peaceful resettlement under Vorthak rule. Intelligence had assured him these elderly humans would be relieved to have someone else taking responsibility for their safety. As his anti-gravity vehicles settled onto the quiet main street, Thekmore felt confident this would be the easiest occupation duty he had ever performed. The human warriors they would be dealing with were clearly past any ability to cause trouble. The war was essentially over. Behind him, 300 Vortac ships prepared to deploy occupation forces to similar communities across Earth, ready to accept the grateful surrender of 50 million harmless retired veterans. None of them noticed that the streets seemed unusually empty for a community that supposedly thrived on social interaction. None of them wondered why the surveillance drones had never recorded what the retired humans did inside their homes during the long hours when they weren't visible in public. None of them questioned why a species that had conquered half the galaxy would allow their most experienced warriors to live in unguarded, easily accessible communities. Commander Veltar was about to learn that the Vortac Empire's intelligence network, despite 8 months of careful observation, had completely misunderstood what human military retirement actually meant. The first lesson would be delivered by an elderly human male standing outside a small hardware store, holding what appeared to be a simple repair tool. His name was Bill Thompson, and he had been waiting patiently for this moment since the first Vortac ship had appeared on Earth's sensors. He was about to teach the galaxy what 30 years of Marine Corps service followed by 20 years of unrestricted preparation actually produced. Squad leader Thekmore stepped out of his transport onto the quiet street of Millfield, expecting to see frightened civilians hiding in their homes. Instead, he found the morning surprisingly normal. Birds chirped in the trees. A gentle breeze moved through the leaves. The only human visible was an elderly male standing outside a small shop, examining what looked like a metal tool in his weathered hands. The human appeared to be exactly what their intelligence had predicted. Gray hair, lined face, wearing simple civilian clothes that hung loosely on his aging frame. He moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose joints had seen better days. The perfect example of a harmless retired warrior who posed no threat to anyone. Thekmore approached confidently, his universal translator humming to life as he prepared to deliver the standard occupation speech. His squad of 12 elite Vortac soldiers spread out behind him in a relaxed formation. This was going to be the easiest first contact in military history. Human, Thekmore announced, his voice carrying the authority of conquest. I am Squad Leader Thekmore of the Vortac Empire. Your planetary military has been defeated. You will comply with occupation protocols and prepare for relocation processing. The elderly human looked up from the metal object in his hands. His eyes were a pale blue color that seemed almost transparent in the morning light. When he spoke, his voice carried the calm tone of someone discussing the weather. Well now, son, the human said, setting the tool down on a wooden counter beside him, I think there might be some confusion here. My name's Bill Thompson. Been living in this town for about 15 years now, ever since I retired from the Marine Corps. Served 30 years, saw action in more places than I care to remember. Thekmore felt a brief flicker of concern. This human was admitting to military service, but his demeanor remained completely non-threatening. Perhaps some of the retired warriors retained memories of their combat days but had lost the physical ability to act on them. Your past service is irrelevant, Thekmore replied. You are now under Vortac authority. Resistance will result in termination. Bill Thompson nodded slowly as if considering this information carefully. He reached under his counter and pulled out what appeared to be another tool from his workshop. But as his hands moved with sudden mechanical precision, Thekmore realized with horror that it wasn't a repair tool at all. The rifle that appeared in the old human's grip was unlike anything in the Vortac databases. It seemed to be constructed from various components, some clearly human military equipment and others that looked like they had been improvised from civilian materials. But the way Bill handled it spoke of decades of familiarity with weapons far more sophisticated than anything their intelligence had suggested these retired humans possessed. See, here's the thing about military retirement, Bill said conversationally, even as he smoothly worked the weapon's action. When you're active duty, you've got rules, regulations, orders from higher up the chain, permission to request before you can engage targets. Rules of engagement that tell you when and how you're allowed to fight. The first shot took down Thekmore's communications specialist before anyone could react. The second eliminated his heavy weapons operator. The third punched through the armor of his squad's most experienced soldier. But when you retire, Bill continued, his voice never changing from that calm, grandfatherly tone, all those restrictions go away. No more asking permission. No more waiting for orders. No more worrying about proportional response or minimizing collateral damage. Thekmore tried to bring his own weapon to bear, But the old human moved with a speed and precision that defied everything the Vortak knew about aging biology. Every shot was perfectly placed. Every movement was economical and deadly. This wasn't the desperate flailing of a frightened civilian. This was the work of a master craftsman who had spent decades perfecting his trade. Across Millfield, similar scenes were playing out with terrifying consistency. Patrol 7 had encountered an elderly human female named Dorothy Miller in her garden. When they demanded surrender, she had mentioned something about 40 years in military intelligence before the flower beds around her house erupted in carefully planned explosions that eliminated the entire squad. Patrol 12 found themselves under precise sniper fire from what appeared to be a harmless old man feeding birds in the town park. James Walker, according to the identification they recovered later, had served 25 years in special operations. His neighbors would later mention that he had always been quiet about his war stories, preferring to talk about his bird-watching hobby instead. The aliens were learning that human military retirement wasn't biological deactivation. It was administrative freedom. By noon, 17 Vortak patrols had entered Millfield expecting to process docile civilians. None had reported back to the command ship. The few scattered emergency transmissions that made it through painted a picture that seemed impossible: elderly humans moving like ghosts through familiar terrain, striking from concealed positions, and disappearing before reinforcements could respond. Commander Veltar stared at his tactical display in growing disbelief as similar reports flooded in from suburbs and small towns across the planet. The harmless retired veterans weren't just resisting the occupation. They were systematically destroying it with a cold efficiency that spoke of extensive training and unlimited preparation time. His communications officer looked up from his station with barely controlled panic. "Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the surface. It's from one of the humans." The image that appeared on the main screen showed Bill Thompson sitting calmly in what appeared to be his hardware store. Behind him, Vortak weapons and equipment were displayed alongside human tools like trophies from a successful hunt. He was cleaning his rifle with the methodical care of someone who had performed this task thousands of times. "To whom it may concern up there," Bill began, looking directly into the camera with those pale blue eyes, "you boys seem to have gotten the wrong idea about what military retirement means down here on Earth. See, when we were active duty we had to follow orders. Had to get permission before engaging targets. Had to worry about international law and political consequences and making sure we didn't upset the brass with unauthorized actions." He set down his cleaning rod and looked directly at the camera with a smile that was both grandfatherly and absolutely terrifying. "We don't have those problems anymore." Within 2 hours of the first alien attacks, something remarkable began happening across Earth. In retirement communities, suburban neighborhoods, and small towns where former soldiers had settled to enjoy their peaceful golden years, old communication networks that had been dormant for decades suddenly sparked back to life. Robert Hayes rolled his wheelchair up to the radio equipment in the Oakwood Veterans Center, his fingers moving across the controls with muscle memory that 40 years of retirement hadn't dimmed. His legs might have been destroyed by shrapnel in Vietnam, but his mind remained as sharp as the day he had left the Signal Corps. The radio crackled to life under his experienced touch. All stations, this is Oakwood Base calling any station. We have hostile alien contact. Repeat, hostile alien contact confirmed. Network 7 is now active. Please respond." The replies came faster than Robert had dared hope. Betty Watson's voice crackled through from her diner in Kansas, confirming that strange ships had been spotted over her area too. Michael Roberts checked in from Colorado, reporting that his hunting group had already engaged enemy patrols with deer rifles and homemade explosives. These weren't panicked civilians calling for help. These were experienced soldiers falling back on training they had never really forgotten. The aliens had made a critical error in their intelligence gathering. They had observed the daily routines of retired veterans and assumed these represented the full extent of their capabilities. They had watched elderly humans playing card games and chess, never realizing these were military minds staying sharp through strategy games. They had seen garden clubs and fishing expeditions, never understanding that these were reconnaissance and supply gathering activities disguised as hobbies. In Portland, Ann Phillips received a phone call that changed her from a quiet librarian back into Staff Sergeant Phillips in the space of a single conversation. Her old Air Force squadron mate was calling in a favor from 30 years ago, and muscle memory took over immediately. Within an hour, Ann had retrieved equipment from hiding places throughout her house, items she had almost forgotten she still maintained, gear that most people would assume was antique junk but which she had kept in perfect working condition. The library's bell tower provided an excellent observation position overlooking the main highway. and settled into position with her rifle, the same model she had used in service but upgraded with improvements she had made during her retirement hobby projects. Her first target was an alien reconnaissance drone that had been circling the area for 20 minutes. Her second shot eliminated the squad sent to investigate why their drone had stopped transmitting. Former Staff Sergeant Phillips had always been an excellent marksman, but retirement had given her something her younger self had never possessed: unlimited time to practice and the patience to wait for absolutely perfect shots. The coordination happening across the country would have impressed any military strategist. These retired veterans weren't operating as isolated individuals. They were functioning as a network that spanned the entire continent, using communication methods and codes they had learned decades earlier and practiced as hobbies during their retirement years. Tom Wilson had spent his 20 years since leaving the Navy SEALs running a small boat repair shop in a quiet coastal town. His neighbors knew him as a friendly guy who could fix any engine and always had time to help with boat problems. What they didn't know was that Tom had spent his retirement years thinking carefully about unconventional warfare tactics, studying the boats and harbors of his area, and quietly preparing for conflicts he had hoped would never come. When the alien ships appeared over his town, Tom was ready. His boat repair shop became a weapons factory, turning everyday marine equipment into implements of war with modifications he had been planning for years. His knowledge of the local waterways, combined with 20 years of special operations experience and 2 decades of preparation time, made him a threat the aliens never saw coming. The most terrifying aspect for the Vortak forces was discovering that these elderly warriors seemed to anticipate their every move. What looked like supernatural prediction was actually the result of military experience applied without the constraints that had once limited their actions. These retired soldiers had spent years thinking about warfare as a theoretical problem, gaming out scenarios in their minds, and preparing for situations they might never face. Helen Baker exemplified this perfectly. She had left the Army's Chemical Warfare Division 30 years ago to become a high school chemistry teacher. Her students had always wondered why she seemed to know so much about chemistry that wasn't in their textbooks, why her demonstrations were so much more impressive than other teachers, and why she kept such an extensive laboratory in her home basement. When the aliens brought in heavy weapons to break the human resistance, Helen introduced them to compounds that didn't exist in any Vortak database. Her background in military chemistry, combined with 3 decades of teaching experience and unlimited access to school laboratory equipment, had produced innovations that active military chemists would never have been authorized to develop. The aliens began to realize they weren't fighting random groups of elderly civilians. They were facing a coordinated insurgency led by master warriors who had spent their retirement years perfecting their craft without any of the institutional limitations that had once constrained them. David Miller's workshop had always impressed his neighbors with the scope of his projects and the precision of his craftsmanship. What they hadn't realized was that his background in Special Forces explosives work had never really ended, it had just become a hobby instead of a job. When the aliens escalated to heavy weapons, David responded with innovations that would have required months of approval processes during his active service days. Now he didn't need anyone's permission. The Vortak Empire had prepared to fight Earth's military. They had not prepared to fight Earth's retirees, warriors who combined decades of experience with complete operational freedom and the terrible motivation that comes from defending the world where their grandchildren lived. They were learning the difference between soldiers who follow orders and warriors who make their own rules. The Vortak Empire's response to their mounting casualties was exactly what military doctrine demanded: overwhelming force applied without restraint. Commander Veltar authorized heavy artillery bombardment of human population centers, believing that raw firepower would finally break the resistance of these surprisingly dangerous elderly civilians. He had no way of knowing that this decision would unleash something far worse than anything his forces had encountered so far. In the small town of Riverside, former Marine Colonel Jack Morrison received reports that alien heavy weapons were being deployed against civilian targets. At 75 years old, Jack moved with the careful precision of a man whose joints protested every morning, but his tactical mind remained as sharp as the day he had commanded troops in active combat zones. He made a phone call that would change the nature of the entire conflict. Within 4 hours, 37 military veterans had gathered at the American Legion Hall. They ranged in age from 62 to 89, representing every branch of service and specialties from infantry to nuclear engineering. During their active duty years, any operation they planned would have required approval from multiple command levels, extensive paperwork, and careful consideration of political consequences. Those restrictions no longer applied. The situation has changed, Jack announced to the assembled veterans. Enemy forces are targeting non-combatants with heavy weapons. As of right now, there are no rules of engagement. No limitations on response. No concerns about proportional force or collateral damage. We are defending our homes, our families, and our country from an extinction-level threat. What happened next became known in Vortak military records as the Riverside Massacre, though the aliens never understood that they had been the ones doing the massacring right up until the moment the tables turned completely. Helen Baker had spent her retirement years as a high school chemistry teacher, beloved by students who never suspected that her extensive knowledge came from 25 years as an Army chemical warfare specialist. When the alien bombardment began targeting schools and hospitals, Helen stopped worrying about the restrictions that had limited her during active service. Her basement laboratory, which neighbors had assumed was for grading papers and preparing class demonstrations, became a production facility for compounds that existed in no military manual. The first alien heavy weapons team discovered Helen's work when their equipment began dissolving around them. The second team never had a chance to discover anything at all. Helen had spent decades thinking about chemistry problems that active duty regulations would never have allowed her to explore. Now she had both the motivation and the freedom to apply those theoretical solutions. David Miller's workshop had always been impressive, filled with precisely crafted projects that demonstrated his skill with tools and machinery. His neighbors knew he had served in special forces but assumed his explosive expertise had faded with age. When the aliens brought in artillery that threatened his grandchildren's school, David stopped caring about the legal restrictions that had constrained his active duty work. The alien firebase that had been shelling civilian targets simply vanished in a series of explosions that registered on seismic equipment 3 states away. Military investigators would later determine that the destruction had been caused by devices that incorporated principles from David's Special Forces training, innovations from his engineering background, and improvements he had developed during 30 years of retirement projects. The psychological impact on Vortak forces proved even more devastating than the physical casualties. Their warriors were trained to fight organized military units with predictable tactics and institutional limitations. Instead, they faced opponents who seemed to possess unlimited creativity, infinite patience, and absolutely no restrictions on their methods of warfare. Susan Clark exemplified this new reality. During her Air Force career, she had been constrained by regulations, chain of command protocols, and political considerations that limited how aggressively she could pursue enemy targets. At 70 years old, those constraints had vanished along with her concerns about career advancement and diplomatic consequences. Susan coordinated strikes against alien positions with a ruthlessness that would have been impossible during her active service. She had already buried her husband and raised her children to adulthood. The political ramifications that might have restrained a younger officer simply didn't exist for her anymore. She fought with the focused intensity of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to protect. The aliens' heavy weapons became liabilities rather than advantages when their operators couldn't survive long enough to use them. Former snipers with decades of hunting experience took positions that active military personnel would never be authorized to use: church steeples, school rooftops, hospital buildings. These retired warriors had no concerns about international law or rules of warfare. Their only objective was stopping an invasion of their world. Margaret Williams demonstrated how completely the conflict had changed. Her 40 years in Army intelligence had been spent working within strict legal frameworks, following protocols designed to protect both military personnel and civilian populations. When alien forces began systematically targeting retirement communities, those protective protocols became irrelevant. Margaret's basement, which neighbors assumed contained photo albums and holiday decorations, actually housed communication equipment that she had maintained and upgraded throughout her retirement. Her knowledge of psychological operations, combined with decades of patient observation and preparation, allowed her to feed false information to alien forces that led entire battalions into carefully prepared ambush zones. The Vortak Empire had expected to fight Earth's military according to conventional rules of warfare. Instead, they found themselves fighting Earth's retirees according to no rules at all. These elderly humans combined master-level military expertise with complete operational freedom and the terrible motivation that comes from protecting grandchildren. Commander Veltar watched his tactical displays with growing horror as casualty reports flooded in from across the planet. His forces weren't just losing battles, they were being systematically destroyed by opponents who seemed to anticipate every move and respond with innovations that defied all military logic. The humans, he realized, had been preparing for this war for decades without even knowing it was coming. And now that it had arrived, they were fighting it with the accumulated wisdom of lifetime warriors who no longer cared about anything except winning. 3 months after the invasion began, Commander Veltar stood in his ship's command center, preparing to deliver the most humiliating report in Vortak military history. The tactical displays around him told a story that defied everything the Empire understood about warfare and aging. Earth had not simply repelled their invasion, the humans were now pursuing Vortak forces beyond their own atmosphere. The retired veterans had done something no military strategist had thought possible. They had studied captured alien technology, reverse-engineered weapons and systems, and begun producing improvements that surpassed the original designs. Gary Peterson, a former Navy engineer who had spent his retirement rebuilding classic cars in his garage, had somehow managed to understand alien propulsion systems well enough to sabotage them from the inside. His neighbors had always been impressed by Gary's ability to make any engine run better than when it was new. They had never suspected that his engineering background, combined with 60 years of mechanical curiosity, would prove capable of analyzing technology from another star system and finding ways to make it work against its creators. The most disturbing reports came from Margaret Williams, a retired Army intelligence officer who had spent her golden years volunteering at the local library. While the Vortak had been focused on her public activities, helping children with homework and organizing book clubs, Margaret had been applying 4 decades of intelligence experience to understanding alien communication protocols. She had cracked their military codes within weeks and was now feeding false information to Vortak commanders that led entire fleets into ambush zones. Her decades of experience in psychological operations, combined with unlimited time to study intercepted communications, had made her more dangerous as a civilian than she had ever been as an active duty officer. Commander Veltar activated the quantum communication link to Vortak High Command, knowing that his career was effectively over. The holographic images of the Supreme War Council materialized before him, their expressions already showing the displeasure that came from receiving reports of unprecedented military failure. High Command, Veltar began, his voice carrying the weight of defeat. I must report that our fundamental understanding of human military structure was completely incorrect. What we interpreted as biological deactivation after military service was actually the removal of operational restrictions. The evidence was overwhelming and terrifying. Frank Davis, 90 years old and moving with the careful steps of someone whose body had seen nearly a century of use, had single-handedly eliminated an entire Vortak armored column. His method had combined knowledge gained during World War II with equipment borrowed from a construction site and 7 decades of thinking about how he might have approached the problem differently if he had been given complete freedom to act. The aliens had assumed that human aging would diminish combat effectiveness. Instead, they discovered that it removed the caution and institutional constraints that had limited these warriors during their active service years. Frank didn't worry about collateral damage, political consequences, or preserving enemy equipment for intelligence purposes. He simply applied everything he had learned about warfare to the problem of stopping an invasion. The humans do not become weaker with military retirement, Veltar continued. Their service appears to be extended training for a lifetime of warfare capability. Retirement removes the limitations that had been constraining their effectiveness. The High Command listened in stunned silence as Veltar described encounters with human veterans who fought with patient lethality that seemed to defy biological aging. These elderly warriors had spent their retirement years studying warfare as an intellectual exercise, practicing skills they had learned in service, and preparing for conflicts they might never face. Betty Watson exemplified this terrifying reality. At 78, she ran a small diner in Kansas that served coffee and homemade pie to local farmers and truck drivers. Her customers knew she had served in the army but assumed her military days were long behind her. When alien forces arrived in her area, Betty revealed that her kitchen had been serving as a cover for activities that would have required extensive authorization during her active duty years. The explosives she had prepared using common ingredients available in any restaurant kitchen eliminated 3 Vortak patrols before they realized they weren't facing a helpless elderly civilian. Betty's knowledge of chemistry, logistics, and tactics, combined with decades of preparation and complete operational freedom, made her more dangerous as a diner owner than she had ever been as a soldier. Veltar's communications officer interrupted with another transmission from Earth. The image showed Bill Thompson once again, still sitting calmly in his hardware store, but now the walls behind him displayed a mixture of human and alien technology that represented innovations the Vortak Research Division couldn't even understand. To the Vortak High Command, the elderly human began, his grandfatherly appearance completely at odds with the devastating effectiveness his kind had demonstrated. This is Bill Thompson speaking for Earth's veteran community. We've had some time to examine your technology and discuss terms among ourselves. Thompson gestured to the hybrid weapons visible behind him, devices that combined alien engineering with human improvements in ways that defied the Empire's understanding of technological development. You have two choices, he continued with the calm tone of someone discussing weekend plans. You can leave immediately and spread the word throughout the galaxy that Earth is under the protection of people you really don't want to disturb further. He paused to pick up a device that Veltar recognized as an improved version of their most advanced plasma rifle, modified with components that shouldn't have been compatible but somehow worked better than the original design. Or you can stay and learn why human societies invest so much time and resources taking care of their military veterans. It's not because we become harmless when we retire. His smile was warm and grandfatherly and absolutely terrifying. It's because we become unrestricted. The transmission ended, leaving the Vortak High Command facing a choice between humiliating retreat and complete annihilation at the hands of beings they had dismissed as harmless elderly civilians. Within 6 hours, every Vortak ship had left Earth's solar system. Within 6 days, warning broadcasts were transmitted to every known civilization in the galaxy. The message was simple and urgent. Humanity was not to be approached with hostile intent. Their retired military veterans represented a threat level that exceeded current classification systems. The galaxy learned a new truth that day. On Earth, military retirement didn't mean the end of a warrior's dangerous phase. It meant the beginning of their most lethal period, experienced, unrestricted, and with a lifetime to perfect the art of warfare.